One thing that I would like this community to take away from this conversation is that history is not one-sided. There's at least three sides of every story, and those I want them to take away that we need to be critical of not only the information that we receive, but just being skeptical that what we're hearing is the only side of the story. Question history, question it in a very um, uh,
But
qualifiable
have you
way.
ever thought, what if this is all just a dream? Have you ever thought?
Hello, my name is K.A. Simpson. I am an author. I'm a creative. I do a lot of kind of arts programming around the city of Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky. I am author of Flipped, Cincinnati's Great Places and Spaces and the Black Narratives in those spaces. And that was for a grant, the Black and Brown Artist Grant provided by ArtsWave. Actually, this is my third time receiving the grant. So we won't go into first time was a play that was performed at the Aronoff that I wrote. But the last 2 years, I did get a grant from ArtWave to put on this type of project. So you are correct. The first time it was a podcast with the same title. And so what I did was to find those stories that are in and around Northern Kentucky and Cincinnati that kind of put Black and brown faces at the narrative. So the second year, I was able to make a book on it. So I've written the book, and it's not just kind of a transcription of the podcast. The podcast was more interviews with individuals, kind of me going on site to different spaces to talk about those stories that we found in and around Northern Kentucky and Cincinnati. The book is more of something that's going to last a little bit longer, a little bit more static, more technical writing a little bit, but kind of like with my kind of flair for storytelling. And things like that. So if you know my brand, it's not going to be flat. It's not going to be one dimensional. It's kind of a three-dimensional writing piece talking about history. So I love it. I am born and raised Northern Kentuckian. My great grandmother came here with her family when she was 5, back in 1905, and pretty much was born, raised, and died in the same house on Saratoga and Newport, Kentucky. So what that means is that every time I walk out the door, it's a family reunion with somebody. It's like, hey, Kareem, how's mom doing? It's like our entire family has grown up in and around this area. So my love of history actually came from my mom. Because when we would go driving around as a child, middle school or elementary school age kids, she would tell me about these spaces that we would pass on just to pass time, these spaces, buildings, areas of the city. And she actually she talked more about those Black and brown faces that made those spaces great. So she put that love um, of that in me. And then kind of growing up, you go to school and you get the more quote unquote traditional education. And I didn't see the same stories that I heard growing up. I didn't see them being manifested in like my history books or what I learned at school. And so when I started to write, I wanted to make sure that those Black and brown faces were the center narrative. So I started my artistic journey by writing a book called Chronicles of a Boy Misunderstood, which is fiction, but it's historical fiction, and it takes place here in Greater Cincinnati. And so I used those stories that my mom told me, or kind of fictionalized them, and put a gay Black male at the center of each of the four stories in the book. And so that's where it started. And then it kind of manifested into a little bit more of a historical context, because as I grew up, I still didn't hear those stories that I heard about growing up. And I wanted everybody to know about them. And it wasn't necessarily about my family. It's just the individuals that we grew up, the stories that were passed down from my great grandmother, my grandmother, and my mother. And I just wanted to make sure that they were memorialized in some way. So the title of my book is, like you said, it's the same title of the podcast, and it's called Flipped. And I named it that because I wanted to flip the narrative. I wanted to flip the kind of when we think of history or the traditional context of history, at least in northern Kentucky, has been kind of history that kind of left out the black and brown faces that made that history or was part of that history. So I wanted to flip the narrative and make sure that to incorporate not to not to downplay anything that we've already learned, but to incorporate and add that historical context that was experienced by the black and brown people of northern Kentucky and Cincinnati. The theme this year with ArtsWave was truth and innovation. So it's had a couple of different names over the last few years, and it's always kind of transcend to moving forward. So when we think about innovation, this is kind of looking forward, making sure like what are we going to do. We've kind of had some time to think about a lot of things, to reflect, and now we need to take that reflection, what have we learned from that reflection, and move forward. And in the piece flipped in my book, I tell these stories of black and brown people in northern Kentucky and Cincinnati, not to criticize anyone, not to blame anyone, but to show that there's a context. And as we move forward, each of the chapters kind of have a piece about moving forward. And as we move forward to make this region a better place for everyone, we want to make sure that we keep these stories in the back of our mind so we don't repeat the past. And so, again, these stories aren't. Again, to blame anyone, to ridicule, but just to show a little bit more of the truth of the story so that we have a clearer way to move forward. I think my truth is making sure that not only I have a space to create and a space at the table to be not decisive, but to weigh in on major decisions or major outcomes of things moving forward. That's my truth. I guess I haven't been that way so much in the past. I've always been hard headed. I've always been outspoken. I think this book and this project, actually, over the last 2 years, has helped me to become kind of more strategic in that path forward. Or maybe I'm just getting old. Maybe, whatever. No. I really think it's just it's the books. It's the books and the projects. It's making me think to actually take a look at the past and to help move forward and to become more strategic and to tell my truth and not to be scared to tell my truth. Uh, I think growing up in Northern Kentucky, it's very different than growing up in Cincinnati, and you might not think so just because we're right across the river. But the population of Northern Kentucky, the African American population, is considerably less than the African American population in Cincinnati. So Northern Kentucky average it's about 7%, and that's being generous. Cincinnati African American population is about 35, 37%. So finding your space as a black man that lives identifies as queer here in northern Kentucky, it ain't easy. And so you're always kind of battling. I'm going down a rabbit hole a little bit, but it's I think this book and this project kind of helps me tell my truth in that way and empowers me to hold and create space that's conducive of the region moving forward. Over the course of me writing this book, it's kind of impacted me in the same way. I've been able to, I guess, it's watching people read the stories or learn about the stories and kind of be fascinated that this happened or that happened. Telling people about the connection between Northern Kentucky's DeVue Park and the West End of Cincinnati. Who would have known that there was a connection there? Or talking about how the first internationally acclaimed African American artist was here in Cincinnati, and we have originals of his artwork hanging up at the Taft Museum of Art. And that's still, even though the museum has been there for 80 some odd years, people are still discovering that space now. And so I think outside of I guess the second largest impact is kind of watching people learn about these stories and then move forward to tell other people about these stories as well. One thing that I would like this community to take away from this conversation is that history is not one-sided. There's at least three sides of every story, and those I want them to take away that we need to be critical of not only the information that we receive, but just being skeptical that what we're hearing is the only side of the story. Question history, question it in a very um, uh, qualifiable way. Throughout this process, writing the book, we kind of wanted to make sure. I usually self-publish my books, but we had some interest by History Press to publish the book. So we are working. So actually, this will be my first actually. Traditionally published book. And if you're not familiar with History Press, they're the books that you see a lot of smaller books. They do local histories around the United States. So those kind of old timey book covers with History Press, Cincinnati, History Press, Ludlow, Kentucky, History Press. So they'll be picking this up as, and so we're in the editing process right now. So look for it in early 2025. It's a misconception about segregated communities. So you can liken it to, like, I went to an all boys high school the first high school I went to, and yes, we were segregated, but we didn't know what we were missing, right? And kind of like that co-ed education. So many times, and I'm kind of jumping out on a limb here to saying, like, towards the end of segregation, so like in the mid 50, so like in the 40s, mid 50s. So when you are living with like-minded individuals, you kind of it's a little bit better. I have heard over the years, those that have been in segregated and desegregated schools, that that the Black community received a better education when the schools were segregated, only because the teachers cared about what they learned and how they learned. When it was desegregated, you didn't get that level of attention. Um, and I mean, and I'm not surprised with that. When you send a Black kid to a white school and the white and that school doesn't want them there, yes, they're not gonna get that level of attention. So I was not surprised. I've heard that story um, uh, a lot, and I don't I can definitely see the reasoning behind it.